Hello, good morning. My name is Rosie Day. I'm a director at Westminster Property Association. I'm pleased to be moderating today's webinar, which is about homes for Westminster. How can the private sector, public sector and affordable housing providers deliver the homes that Westminster needs? And we're going to be focusing particularly on affordable and intermediate housing as prioritised in the new Westminster City Plan. I'm delighted we've got an expert panel to discuss just that. We have Barbara Brownlee, Managing Director from Westminster Builds, Olivia Harris, WPA Board Member and Chief Executive of affordable housing charity Dolphin Living, Robert Pert, Head of Affordable Housing Development and Regeneration at Savills, and Tom Pocock, Managing Director of St Edward, division of the Barclay Group. And last but not least, we have Katie Warwick, Head of London Residential Development Research at Savills. And Katie will be kicking us off with an opening presentation about Westminster's housing market. Now, before I hand over to Katie, I'd like to remind viewers that after the panel discussion with Barbara, Olivia, Robert and Tom, we've got plenty of time for audience Q&As. So really encourage your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Or you can message us on Twitter and our handle is @BWPA. So without further ado, I'll hand the virtual stage over to Katie Warwick. Katie.
Thanks, Rosie. I'm just going to share my screen now. Has that come up? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the sales and the rental market, as well as our forecasts, and then I'll zoom in on Westminster specifically, looking a bit at the supply pipeline, and I'll also touch on some of the highlights from the new Westminster City Plan. So there's lots of different factors driving the market at the moment. Just move on slides, there we go. Not least, the experience of lockdown has made many people reconsider what they want from their home. But of course, not everyone has been able to sort of capitalize on that. Lots of people want different things, but can they afford it? So we're seeing a real difference in terms of the activity at different price points. We've seen very low price growth in London, across the whole of London, pre-pandemic. So in the 2 years up to 2019, we'd seen price falls of around 5%. And in the last year, during 2020, London average values grew between sort of 4 and 6%, depending on which index you use. Westminster as a borough, according to the Land Registry, saw 3% growth last year. But if we think about the activity in the market, it has been shaped by the stamp duty holiday, as well as the government support for furlough and earnings. On the graph on the left here, we've got, it shows the level of activity in the market. So sales agreed, and we're using 20 CI data, which is a scraping of property listings. So it uses Rightmove, Find a Property, all of those. It's not just Savills data. We're capturing the whole market here, and we've split out the activity by different price bands. And we've also helpfully shaded the 3 different sections of these time periods, because of course, the first half of last year was when we saw the first lockdown, and we saw activity drop quite significantly in April and May. And as we came through into June and approached July, when the stamp duty holiday was announced and implemented, we saw a real resurgence in activity in the market, but to differing degrees depending on what price band you look at. So you can see there that the markets above 500,000 did actually rebound a little bit stronger than the rest, and you can see that it has remained that way throughout. The second half of last year, that sort of blue background section of my graph there, it is partly due to that pickup in activity, is partly due to the stamp duty holiday, but also because these are the people who are most able to access the market at that time, were the people who had greater job security and access to finance, and they tended to be in the slightly upper value bands across London. And then in that yellow period, of course, the disruption to the market as we had towards the end of the last year was around thinking about that stamp duty deadline, which we thought was end of March, but then got extended. So you can see a bit of a disruption there where, again, in sort of February and March, we started to see a pickup in activity, which has just, some of the early indicators are showing that it's just starting to slow in the last month. So that's the sales market. It's a very different story in the rental market, and I'm sure there's been some pretty damning headlines which I'm sure won't have escaped you, but we do think that I'll explain the reasons why we do think this is relatively short-lived, and it has affected inner London much more strongly than outer London. There's a number of reasons why people have the people who have particularly like living central, renting centrally, lots of corporate demand, overseas students, domestic students. These are the people who frankly haven't been in London for the last year. Private renters are also more exposed to those economic pressures, potentially on lower incomes and than those in the owner-occupied market, and are therefore more likely to be, in those working in those industries where you would have expected the furloughing scheme to be helping out, but it does mean that those people are affected more heavily. There's also less need for those younger sharers to be in London. Certainly a lot of people that I know that I work with, the younger staff have gone back to the family home to live with their family during this strange time. And again, that's not going to be a permanent feature of the market. They are going to come back at some point. We expect sort of out towards the end of this year. So I talked a bit about the demand side, but what about supply? Because rental supply, there is a lot of rental supply on the market at the moment. And one of the interesting factors there is that there's been an increase, whilst there's been this reduction in demand, there's also been an increase in rental stock, because much of the Airbnb market, those landlords were also looking for security, and they flipped their stock. If they can't get any tourists in, they flipped their stock onto the PRS, the regular PRS market. And again, we think that's a temporary factor, and it's likely that trend will reverse when London becomes more open again. So just to touch briefly or summarize some of the drivers that I've already talked about, and this is sort of building the story as to where we think prices will go over the next few years. We had thought that there was going to be a bit of a cliff edge in activity in the market, and also maybe a reduction in the level of price growth at the point where the stamp duty holiday ended. But because we now have this extension and it is tapered through till September, we do think that is likely to sort of mitigate that short-term risk of a cliff edge in activity. So we will see a gradual decline in the level of activity as we reach towards the end of this year. And of course, at the same time, there is this sort of renewed confidence in across many different markets, just thinking generally around the vaccine rollout and how successful and quick that has been, and the easing of social distancing, as well as falling unemployment levels towards the back end of this year. Although it is worth noting that London has fared a little bit worse in terms of unemployment rates compared to other regions. The prolonged sort of period of lockdown, there will still be some people who will be looking for more space, but we do think that, again, as London starts to reopen, the offices start to be populated again, we will start to see London look more attractive again. It will ease that rush to the country. And of course, there is more stock available in London. And the key factor is that actually over the last year, the housing market, we've seen house price growth at a time when the economy has been contracting. So in a technical, recession, to see such strong house price growth is a really strange, unusual situation, and we certainly haven't seen that before. The expectation is that actually, that trend will reverse as we start to move past this peak in unemployment. We still have interest rates that will be low for a long time, we expect, and that will start to, those economic fundamentals will start to revert back into supporting stronger house price growth. But London still has an affordability challenge, and Westminster is no exception to that. It's certainly one of the worst, which I will, in terms of the affordability challenge, which I'll touch on a little bit. The government has obviously sort of stepped in and sort of thinking about clearly Help to Buy is coming to an end in 2023, and thinking about what might be the factor that replaces that. They've sort of put out the consultation on first homes. They've also announced the mortgage guarantee scheme, but for London, the figures don't really add up. It doesn't really work in London to the same extent that it will support, it's a national policy, and the loan to income ratios in London, it will be a restrictive factor for the success of those particular schemes. So, affordability is a massive issue. Just to touch really quickly on our price growth forecasts, in the immediate growth in the London market, we've seen, as a result of that flurry of activity. And I think actually, it will start to become, as I've mentioned, more closely aligned with those economic factors as you start to move through. We see in 2022, we see that we move past that peak in unemployment. However, for London, it is more exposed to very slight interest rate rises, which we use Oxford Economics forecasts here on the economic indicators, and they expect that we will see a slight increase in interest rates towards the back end of that 5-year period, in London, because it is so stretched, it is quite sensitive to those very small changes. And in the rental market, again, I mentioned the fact that we think this is very much a short-term issue. So even towards the end of next year, we expect that we will be starting to, the end of this year, we will start to be entering into a more sort of healthy rental market as people will start returning to the office. And certainly next year, we expect there to be a lot more activity and as such rental growth. It is really dictated by the speed you see sharers and students coming back and stock returning to Airbnb. So that supply demand imbalance starts to sort of revert to the opposite way. I'm just going to dive straight in on Westminster now, looking at average values, because it is clearly one of the most expensive parts of the country. Here I've put up some figures for the average transaction value of 2020 according to the Land Registry. I've picked some of the neighbouring boroughs, and I think that the sort of the value drop off is quite significant. Less than half in some of those neighbouring boroughs. Barnet and Brent is quite a significant drop off. I think that's quite interesting. But also within the borough itself, there is quite a lot of diversity in terms of values. And there are some pockets of extremely high value areas. I think probably the scale on this map doesn't quite do some of those justice, but it helps us understand the broader picture. But there are also some really much cheaper parts in the borough, and I think actually there's some regeneration going on in some of those areas. There is a lot of social housing and rented accommodation in those areas, and there's some investment being targeted at those. Affordability is a big issue. The disconnect between house prices and earnings is really bad news for people wanting to buy a home, and I think that is why affordable housing and intermediate housing tenures are so important, particularly for key workers, and I use that term loosely. I think there's probably a wider discussion to be had there by the panel. So just moving on to the new build market, here I've got some indicators which I think sort of encapsulates the whole new build market if I were to summarise it in one slide. So here we're looking at the level of starts on site of new homes, the level of completions, and also the new home sales. And bearing in mind the sales usually happen close for the new build market, they happen close to when when the scheme is started on site. So clearly from a developer's point of view, you start on site and you want to sell as quickly as possible to secure that, to secure that sale. And the one factor that is really interesting in this market, and here we're looking at everything above £1,000 a square foot, so that's certainly most homes in Westminster, but also some of those surrounding boroughs, and I'll show you a map on the next slide. But the really interesting thing here is that disconnect between starts on site in yellow and sales in that sort of maroon colour. So you can see that this gap here is where lots of sites were started on site, and the sales, where are those sales? It's sort of, you'd expect there to be a sort of peak here, but it hasn't really happened. It's been much longer and drawn out than that. And I think, so the one key takeaway that you can see from this chart is that there's lots of stock under construction. And the latest sales data from Molior, our analysis of this data shows us that sales of homes over £1,000 a square foot in the last year are 40% down on what they were the year before. So there's, part of this is a lack of international buyers, but also just, a lot of investors in this market, and, it hasn't been the right environment for them to be, particularly, needing to buy. Completions are also low, so I think there's definitely been some struggles around build costs and labour and materials, and I think residential through COVID, especially with the COVID working practices, residential has suffered more than other sectors, because you're dealing with smaller, more enclosed spaces, and certainly in central London, and also very detailed finishes, and I think that has really sort of been quite tricky for some developers. And yeah, just to sort of point out that sort of the record levels of stock that we're seeing under construction at the moment. So where are these? Here is our forecasts, everything that we expect to be on the market over the next 5 years. And so the borough boundary for Westminster is here. And you can see that in many of the other boroughs, there are these big clusters, you know, you've got big clusters, lots of big towers. You don't really see that in Westminster because of the lack of land, and you know, it's very, very densely populated already, but also the importance of, you know, of Westminster as a commercial centre means that you don't see the huge amounts of residential. You see much more smaller residential sites, and especially in these very expensive areas. You know, this is Mayfair and so on there. But what we have seen is that a small cluster up here around Paddington and Edgware Road, and perhaps we'll hear some more about that. You know, we just don't see the same land availability. So just moving on to a bit more of the policy side of this, you know, the figures. Westminster in the new plan, it's clearly committed to increasing delivery, but it has ended up with a land constrained target. So the draft plan highlighted that they would be delivering around 1,500 homes a year, but actually by the time the inspectorate had reviewed that, they identified capacity for, you know, just under 1,000. So that has been reduced down. The housing delivery test, the latest housing delivery test is that is the government's test for measuring the rate of delivery across every local authority in the country, and Westminster scored 92%, which is across all of the London boroughs, it's about average. Around half of the local authorities passed, and just seven needed an action plan to boost the delivery of new homes. So the new plan does address the need to deliver more homes and more affordable homes. So let's just move on towards looking at the level of affordable homes. Now, clearly, in any of the central areas I've picked here just for comparison, Kensington and Chelsea, I had the City of London on here, but it's so minuscule that it doesn't really, you know, show up very well. So, you know, the central areas, higher land values, it's very hard to make it stack up. And also one of the added complications, I think, you know, one of the great things that the borough benefited from over the last 4 years is this sort of addition of affordable housing delivery from commercial development, but actually, you know, over you know, in the new plan, that's no longer going to be, you know, that policy is no longer in place. And just to give you a quick search on Glenegan from looking at the planning permissions of just to give you an idea of the scale. The number of sites that have completed in the last 4 years, five commercial sites have delivered some affordable, either on-site or off-site. So one of them delivered on-site affordable housing, and 4 off-site. And then there's a further 23 sites that we identified that have got planning permission. So again, either to deliver some on-site or off-site contribution for affordable housing, but they're not yet on site. So, you know, maybe they're at risk of maybe you might see those go back in for planning. So that could be interesting sort of side effect of that. And I'll just really quickly leave you with a few thoughts probably for the panel to discuss a bit further, but you know, these are a few of the main points that I see from the Westminster City Plan. These are the ones that are relating to the residential market. The carbon agenda. You know, clearly this is what every borough is looking at as well. And here, this is, you know, Westminster has brought themselves in line with the London plan here, crucially, but also considering the whole life carbon impact. So there's a lot to consider there, especially when looking at, you know, is it demolition versus new build, as demolition versus a refurb, and thinking about the whole carbon cycle there. Westminster, I've already mentioned, really committed to delivering more homes, but is going to be limited by that land availability, and also committed to delivering more affordable housing. So the affordable housing percentage has increased up to 35%, again in line with the London plan, but that was up from the previous plan of 30%. But it doesn't include commercial development. Commercial developers are no longer required to provide affordable housing. Tall buildings also, you know, appear welcome, but ideally sort of located in certain areas where there's already that sort of high density. It looks like sort of Paddington and Victoria opportunity areas, Edgware Road, and some of the clusters that I pointed out on that supply pipeline. Optimization, so the maximum size of a home will be 200 square meters going forward, and that's only really relevant for this sort of super prime market. Again, one of the slight side effects of that at the moment is that there's now going to be this scarcity value for any of those schemes that are currently being built. And again, in line with the London plan, the endorsement of co-living, supportive of co-living and build to rent. So that's my summary of the market. And now I'm going to hand back to Rosie. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. So my first question is going to be to Barbara, and I'd like to ask you what you think the City of Westminster's housing needs actually are, and how Westminster City Council and its property development company, Westminster Build, is using its powers and available funding to help meet that need.
Okay, thanks, Rosie. And Katie, that was a really interesting whiz through Westminster as well as nationally. I mean, there's kind of about two main ways to look at Westminster's housing needs. One is they're pretty infinite, and anybody who could live and could afford to live in Westminster, you know, if they're in London, if they were, would probably love to live in Westminster. So it's a slightly unbounded on a human side. If you do it in the nationally accepted way of looking at housing need, we have a need to build about 250 affordable, in terms of planning policy, section 106, affordable units a year. So, you know, pick a figure in between 250 and infinity, and that is Westminster's housing need. So it's a slightly different place, I think, to other boroughs, because people move in, people work here, people temporarily want to be able to live in Westminster. But within that framework, there is no doubt that the City Council has really ambitious house building targets, right? Really ambitious. And as this plan has been in the drafting since 2017, you know, as city plans are, they take a while. It's been clear for some years that the council has been looking at ways to try and increase housing delivery generally, and affordable housing delivery within its boundaries. It wishes to close the gap. Rosie touched on affordability slightly from the house price end. If you then also set that against income, average income in Westminster is just over 50k a year. House prices 1 million plus, rents 3,000 a month plus. It is not possible for anybody on an average income of 50 a year, which, you know, let's face it, is more than double, you know, a UK living income. So it's still a high income, impossible to live in Westminster. So the council is really, really focused on that bit of the market, which is not planning policy compliant, section 106 affordable, so not council housing necessarily, or statutorily controlled intermediate housing, of which there's about 25% of the borough. Right, about 25% of the borough, people are sometimes surprised to learn, is kind of social housing. Now, obviously, some of that's sold, you know, and is rented, but it's a good stock that is at a different price level, even that which has sold. And that is 25% of the borough. The other 75% of the borough well out of most of our means. So it's that chunk in between. Only 2% of the borough is genuinely seen as affordable housing. And, you know, Olivia on this panel has had a hand in delivering some of that 2%. But that is where Westminster Builds was set up to try and make a difference in that bit of the market that's missing, for people on average incomes to be able to live in Westminster. So, I mean, Westminster Builds has those targets of 2,000 homes over the next 10 years, to sell about 1,000, to keep about 1,000 in terms of rental. They are non-Section 106 homes, but they will be at rents which are set and chosen by the authority, and which obviously we have to make work in a business plan, but which we have much more freedom over. So one side of how we're going to increase house building is through Westminster City's land. I mean, the city a couple of weeks ago, Ebury Bridge, sorry, my internet is saying it's unstable. Is it still working? Ebury Bridge estate got planning permission. Now that is a huge estate regeneration in Zone 1, opposite Chelsea Barracks, 330 homes originally for council tenants, with the residents, with no objections from the residents, with only 4 objections at planning, right, from the whole piece, we secured planning permission to double the density on that estate, to build 750 new homes, carbon neutral, decent sized homes. Every resident will go back who wants to go back, to beautifully built sustainable homes that would be highly well managed, high quality public realm. And that in a way is the sort of place the borough can make some of the biggest difference on its own land. Because sort of in theory, that land is almost affordable to build on. I mean, the price of land assembly, even on existing council land, is beyond belief and beyond some pockets. I mean, it has cost to do the land assembly on Ebury and the council's other big regeneration scheme, Church Street, will cost upwards of £90 million. Now that's just sunk cost. There's no return. There's not a developer in the world, I don't think, would pick that up. We can ask Tom, but you know, that is the sort of cost the public sector has to pick up. You'll never get a rent back on it. You'll never get, you know, a house sold to pay for it. You have to move people, you have to buy them other places to live, you have to refurbish it, you have to pay for them to move, and you have to demolish existing failing buildings. And that is the entire area, I think, if local authorities across the whole of London are slightly struggling with. And with a bit more help in that area, they could all use a bit more of their own land to better effect. I don't know, I've gone off in a lot of ways, Rosie. I'm not sure. Would you like to bring another question and bring me back on track somehow?
That's brilliant. Thank you, Barbara. And ties in really nicely with my next question to Olivia, which is, do you think the pandemic has shifted people's perceptions of the type of housing that central London needs, and whether you think the public and policymakers are more aware of the vital role that key workers and those on modest incomes, which Barbara mentioned, are as drivers of the West End?
Thanks, Rosie. Yeah, I think it would have been impossible for the public not to be aware of the pictures of critical workers getting onto crowded public transport last March. And I think since then, much has been said and written publicly about the part that critical workers have played in supporting us all in the last year, and the need for key worker housing near their place of work. And I use the term critical workers to reflect the expanded definition of key workers that aligns with Dolphin's charitable objects. Which is to support those whose work supports the infrastructure of our city. However, I think that people's understanding of the need for the housing could go further in recognising that many of these key workers are on really modest incomes and cannot afford housing near their place of work. And yet, due to shortages in social housing, which I know Barbara's work is going a long way to try and reverse, but there's an acute need of many for social housing. And so key workers are unlikely to be allocated social housing. And whilst this has been recognised in our news, it's got yet to translate into significant policy changes nationally and locally. And many local authorities continue to focus on their need for social housing rather than the wider needs of their communities. Thankfully, as Barbara's outlined, Westminster is one of the local authorities that for some time now has taken a different approach. And it's really pleasing to see that the recently adopted city plan provides for 60% of affordable housing to be homes for intermediate rent, which is accessible and affordable to key workers. That said, and again mentioned by Katie, the unfortunate change to the city plan imposed by the inspector remove the requirement for commercial development to provide affordable housing, something that Westminster Property Association and the City Council have historically delivered together, and we're both keen to see in the new city plan. In terms of policy, the London Plan also promotes the delivery of London Living Rent, a form of intermediate rental housing, which is available to key workers, and WPA and Dolphin have responded to the recent mayoral consultation on intermediate housing. However, there's been some recently proposed national policy, in particular PDR, which doesn't support the delivery of affordable housing or necessarily support the delivery of a housing to meet the need of the local community, and is unlikely to provide any housing affordable to key workers in high value locations such as Westminster and the rest of inner London. And the proposal to increase the exemption to provide affordable housing to larger housing developments, which would have had a real impact on affordable housing delivery in Westminster, has also been scrapped. That said, we're yet to see any positive changes to national policy actually promoting the delivery of housing for key workers. And the Queen's speech only served to reiterate the policy shift towards home ownership, something that does not improve the reality of Westminster's critical workers and their housing needs. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Olivia. And Tom, I was wondering if you could tell us more about St Edward's West End Gate development close to the Edgware Road, which Katie mentions is a key area of housing growth in Westminster. How has this development helped deliver affordable homes both on site and nearby?
Thanks, Rosie, for the question, and Katie for her really engaging presentation earlier. I'm sure many members will be aware of our project at West End Gate, but for those who not, I'll just a quick overview. So the site is located just to the north of Paddington Basin on Edgware Road, and it's a site that lay derelict for about 25 years. Some people might remember it as a car park and a car wash. There have been lots of failed attempts over the years to bring forward the site for development. It had quite a long and checkered planning history as well. And we actually acquired the site in mid-2015, and we secured planning for a new master plan in 2016, which delivered just over 600 homes, including 130 affordable homes. We then acquired 2 further adjoining land holdings, and we secured permission for a revised master plan in 2017. So in total, West End Gate at the moment will deliver 844 homes, of which 175 are affordable homes, and we're also delivering 9 commercial units on the project. We actually build the project ourselves, so Berkeley and St Edward are quite unique in that respect. We are our own contractor, and we have delivered just over 200 homes to date on site to our customers. As Katie touched upon, the selling conditions for the market homes has been quite challenging over the last 12 months for obvious reasons. You know, as Katie highlighted, there's certainly been a slower recovery in the central London market over our sort of projects in the outer London boroughs now into the home counties. We are starting to see inquiries certainly increase again. You know, early on in the lockdown, we went to a very, very heavily based virtual sales platform, which was a kind of new experience for the business. Much of our engagement previously had been face to face, and we still do believe that actually showing customers product and the quality of our products in the sales and marketing suite is really the kind of key thing for the differentiation of the Berkeley quality products. In terms of kind of mixture of market homes on West End Gate, we've got quite a range. We've got studios through to 4-bedroom homes, and we've got quite 2 distinct products in terms of mansion blocks, and also we have the Westmark Tower, which is a 30-storey building, which many of you probably have seen from just above the A40. And these really do appeal to quite a broad range of buyers, both owner-occupiers, investors, domestically and internationally. And I think the key attributes of that site really for us were proximity to the West End, to Little Venice. It's got fantastic public transport links. It's very close to Paddington, and also has really good, you know, extensive residence facilities, cinema, swimming pools, etc., etc. As Rosie sort of touched upon, the market homes there really provide cross subsidy for the affordable. So we are actually delivering a lot of affordable homes on site, 175 in total in 10-year blind blocks. And the first 140 homes, of which 93 are social rented, are actually being delivered in partnership with Westminster City Council, and Barbara's been very heavily involved in that over the last few years. And those homes will help start the decant of the Church Street regeneration project. And a number of these homes are sort of large 3- and 4-bedroom social rented homes. And we're very close to actually handing over the first 2 show homes to Westminster, which marks a really exciting sort of milestone for us on the project. And what this allows residents to come and see is the quality of the homes, you know, the real, you know, touch and feel them. And I think one of the unique things about West End Gate is that it allows, you know, social rented tenants from Church Street to come and see a new home that they can live in, but actually it's still part of their existing community. So they don't have to move away from, you know, Church Street. They can move into a new property literally just across the road, which is a real benefit. And then sort of looking forward, we've recently submitted planning for a further 557 homes on the Paddington Green Police Station site, which will include another 210 affordable homes as part of that proposal. This will really kind of complete the master plan for West End Gate. And in total, if we are successful in securing planning permission for that, this scheme will actually deliver just over 1,400 new homes for Westminster, which we believe is the single largest residential development that's been delivered in Westminster for quite some time. You know, I think just this couldn't be delivered without working in partnership with lots of stakeholders. over many, many years. And I think that's really key to delivering these large regeneration projects. I think we're really proud of what we've achieved at West End Gate in terms of not just the homes that have been delivered, but the jobs, the training opportunities for young people, the public realm, the improvements to the environment. There's been a significant amount of investment through Section 106 and still into the local area. And I think just in sort of conclusion, linking back this to the theme of this event, I think West End Gate is a really good example of how we can work together with Westminster to increase housing supply. These sorts of sites are quite scarce in London and in Westminster. We really need to utilise these brownfield sites to deliver high density housing, but quality high density housing and use tall buildings. Clearly, we benefit from being in an area that the city planners identified for tall buildings. I think it's really imperative that we make the best use of these lands and take on the challenge and maximise the delivery of homes on these sorts of sites, but at the same time ensuring that we deliver wider benefits for the community and all the regeneration effects that go with those.
Great. Thanks, Tom. It's great to hear about the progress happening on site. So now one question for Robert, and I was wondering what the key barriers are to housing delivery. We've heard on the panel so far this sort of old ambition from the private sector, from the public sector and affordable housing providers to deliver the homes Westminster needs. Why isn't it happening?
Thanks, Rosie. Barbara has, I think, very handily summarised some of the, very unique challenges that Westminster has. Clearly, affordable housing is part of a wider housing market in this country, and inextricably so. We've moved, over the last 20 years towards affordable housing being delivered through the planning system. And if you don't, and largely that, in large parts of the country, that does actually work. And I would say that dismantling the planning system wholesale is possibly adds further barriers to delivery, not removing them. In London in 2019-20, over about 40% of delivery of affordable housing was through the planning system, through Section 106. But in Westminster, it is a very, very unique situation. Clearly, it's constrained. Land availability is a major constraint, and affordability is a major constraint. Things like, and I know WPA responded to some of the proposals around permitted development rights. And again, I don't think that's the answer. A lot of affordable housing providers aren't particularly keen on permitted development schemes anyway. It's quite difficult to make them work, both from a technical perspective, a quality perspective, and indeed a financing perspective. I think the other thing is, Barbara mentioned Church Street, Tom's mentioned Church Street, and some of the, it's really important that we capitalise on big schemes like that in a place like Westminster, because some of these bigger strategic schemes are real opportunities. But, the cost and complexity of doing those should not be underestimated. The grant regime for affordable housing does not reflect the complexities of central London development and of complex estate regeneration. And in fact, I'm afraid to say, gone backwards in terms of the current prospectus not really supporting that type of activity. And in a really constrained borough like Westminster, we have to really capitalise on those opportunities, and particularly those public land-led opportunities. But we need to fund them in the right way because they are complex. I think the other area of challenge that I would also like to highlight is, and this is a general challenge for all affordable housing providers. Affordable housing providers, including Westminster City Council as a provider of affordable housing, have enormous challenges, and those challenges are getting, are growing. So we're seeing amongst our client base a huge focus on affordable housing providers looking at their own stock holdings, and investment in those stock holdings. And to some extent, that's diverting attention away from new supply. So affordable housing providers are regulated. They have big challenges ahead in terms of future building standards. Katie mentioned, the carbon agenda. We've got big challenges around post-Grenfell, fire safety, investment. So affordable providers have got a lot on their plate, and a lot of challenges. So that is a little bit of a barrier at the moment that we're seeing in the market to new supply. I think the agenda around home ownership, and Olivia mentioned, mentioned this in her piece, the agenda around home ownership is not massively helpful in a place like Westminster. We know that home ownership is not, low cost home ownership is very, very difficult to achieve in a place like Westminster. So we do need to support intermediate rent. And again, this is where, City Hall and government need to recognise that whole middle ground of intermediate housing, which doesn't have enough policy and grant funding support, in my view. So those are some of the challenges. I don't want to entirely dwell on the challenges, because I think, in Westminster there are big opportunities. Barbara's outlined some of them, and actually it's worth saying that there's enormous interest from a wide range of capital globally, institutions, private capital, landed estates. There is an enormous interest in affordable housing. What we've got to do is we've got to align the interests of that long-term capital with developers and landowners who can share that long-term interest, because you can't deliver, you can't deliver genuinely affordable housing in a price-constrained borough like Westminster if you just have a very short-term approach to development. So I'll leave it there, Rosie, on a slightly more positive note than just focusing on the barriers.
Thank you, Robert. Now we're swiftly running out of time, but one of the points that you raised, Robert, was actually raised in the audience Q&A, which I'll want to take to Barbara very quickly. And then after that, I'll wrap up with a positive question and for you all. So yeah, Barbara, we've had a question which relates to council finances and whether the impact of the pandemic on Westminster City Council's funds is going to affect the delivery of affordable homes on the sites that you manage.
Amazing, isn't it? We all thought Brexit was enough. Fire safety, health and safety, and then the pandemic. But no, we're not reducing any targets. We're reassessing some sites, but so far, I think I'm just searching my mind to make sure I am accurate. Nothing has been cut or is going to be stopped. And it's equally true that actually throughout the last year, our delivery's all been on site. It's been quite amazing what some of the developers and constructors have managed to do throughout, the last year. And in Westminster, we have not had a slowdown. So the COVID has affected the council's finances, there is no doubt. And there is a real look and at just the whole of the council's finances, and with a massive emphasis, which is always there anyway, but value for money. Are we spending in the right place? Is there more we could get for every pound? But that is very essentially the Westminster way anyway, right? That is a part of almost its DNA, is to, value for money. So that exercise has been gone through again. It isn't delaying or reducing any of the housing delivery. It's certainly, there is money being directed to the West End to support the opening of the West End, but there already was a huge commitment to the West End through the Oxford Street Renewal Programme with a large amount of money allocated. So whilst I would say it has started a programme of really, let's reevaluate everything. Thus far, things are all going ahead. I think probably it's safe to say we're not, the thing that Robert said, I mean, the grant regimes, they're nothing. They touch not 1 millimetre of the cost of delivering in central London. They could not be, you don't want to say irrelevant, but it's such teeny amounts of money. It's unbelievable. And the strings that are attached to them are deeply difficult for everyone to abide by. So there isn't much help. So I think the big regeneration projects we have going, we're not dashing out to start more. And in some way that's a shame, because that's where we could really get more affordable units, right? Better use of our own land is the obvious way for councils to go. And that needs more centrally funded help on land assembly and clearance. And that isn't there. So if that came through, we could do more quickly, but we're not stopping what we've got in the programme.
That's good to hear. Thanks, Barbara. Now, if people don't mind us going a bit over time by 4 or 5 minutes, I really would like to ask one final question to all of our panellists, and Katie if you, as well, if that's okay. And that's what you see as sort of the key opportunities to overcoming the barriers that we've discussed. What's you most excited and optimistic about in terms of delivering more homes in Westminster over the coming years? And I'm going to start with Barbara, and then go to Tom, Olivia, Robert, and then Katie. So Barbara.
Sorry, what am I most optimistic about?
Yes,
I think the whole
yes,
change of culture. Sorry, I do have something at 11:15 that I was just saying I'd be late. The change of culture, in a way, the massive commitment to growth, and the acknowledgement that there's something more flexible than just Section 106 affordable needed in central London. There's something that real people need to be able to get their hands on, and they'll never get their hands on, you know, the £1 million houses or the council houses, to be frank, as Olivia said. So that's the real growth, the real optimism for me. The barrier is any support, any financial support from central government is difficult to see, really, it coming through in any meaningful way.
Thanks, Barbara. And if you need to leave, that's absolutely fine.
That's very kind. I really do.
Right.
Thank you ever so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. And then, Tom, what were you optimistic about?
I think for us as a business, modular construction is really interesting. It's a really important innovation in our sector. We've been broadly building homes for the same way for quite some time now. Modular allows us to increase our capacity without relying on traditional methods. It helps us try and address some of the skill shortages and some of the issues we're having around material supply as well. You know, I think many people will know we've recently invested quite heavily in our own Berkeley modular business. We're building a factory down in Northfleet, 150,000 square foot advanced manufacturing facility, which is just in final testing stage at the moment. That will allow us to build homes faster, achieve a better level of build quality, more consistent level of build quality, improve the environmental performance, improve safety and productivity. I think it's a really interesting model that's going to come forward over the coming years. You know, and we're actually looking already at West Lane Gate at some of the later phases now, looking to plan for how do we deliver those some of the taller buildings as well in a potential modular system. So for me, that's a really exciting part of our industry and how we can actually increase the capacity of our delivery side in a constrained city environment as well.
And Olivia?
I think for me, the positives are the change in public sentiment. I really hope that carries through into, changes in policy and changes in what is delivered, particularly in Westminster and in London. And I think also there's some changes coming through in finance with the ESG agenda, which does include that S, which is with social. And I hope that sort of enables us to deliver more affordable housing for key workers in London through lower pricing for those of us that are sort of adhering to that and delivering under the ESG agenda.
Great. Robert?
Thanks, Rosie. Well, mine is in similar vein to Olivia's, really. What's getting us most excited and has done for the last 3 or 4 years is just the enormous interest in financing affordable housing. I can't underestimate just how strong the interest is. There isn't a day goes by that we don't talk to new sources of capital, and we're talking about a huge range of sources of capital. So whilst there's obvious constraints, particularly in Westminster, capital is not necessarily the biggest constraint. And I'm sure there are WPA members and who have long-term interests in the city. We're talking to landed estates and institutions and matching them up with long-term sources of capital, and that's very exciting. And the world of financing affordable housing is changing quite rapidly, So that's certainly reasons for optimism there in terms of deploying capital.
Casey.
So I've tried to think specifically about Westminster, and I think I'm really impressed by the massive commitment to delivery by the council and partners. But just sort of moving away from sort of residential housing for a second, I think it's also about the commitment from Westminster and other central boroughs to getting people back into central London, because I think for many, you know, working from home hasn't worked so well. Certainly younger people, their social lives and so on, but also our Savills head office, I think it will be different when you go back, and it will be better. Our head office is on Margaret Street, which is just off Regent Street, and I've been in a couple of times. It feels, the streetscape feels different. There's benches, there's greenery, there's cycle lanes, and it makes it feel quite nice. So I'm quite excited by that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Apologies for running slightly over time, but massive thank you to Barbara Brownlee, Olivia Harris, Robert Pert, Tom Pocock and Katie Warwick for this morning's seminar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.